So, Mahmood, people are actually, I'm getting requests from participants. They are all in waiting room, so I can't do that.
But yeah, you ignore them. And also we have the office secretary, so he will also do.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah,
Okay.
we can start, I think.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the iSure online discussion titled Talking Text. Today, we are discussing Ashokan Nambiar's book, Print and Novel in 19th Century Kerala, Reconsidering Kerala Modernity. As many of us here know, the advent of print technology in Kerala, brought by colonial inventions, missionary activities, indigenous reformist effort, transformed the way knowledge circulated, debates unfolded, and literature evolved in it. It is truly a special moment for me to introduce today's author, not just an accomplished scholar and writer, but also as a dearest friend. Ashokan's book develops a new approach of reading the early Malayalam novels written in the late 19th century by placing these novels in the context of an emergent of print culture. This book suggests a new way to understand the constitutive character of a particular modernity shaped in Kerala in 19th century. As we begin our discussion, I encourage all of you to engage actively, share your thoughts, ask your questions, and reflect on the themes this book explores. With that, let me turn to our author, Dr. Ashokan Nambiar, to introduce his book and share his thought on this journey. Thank you. Ashoka, over to you.
Thank you, Reg. At the outset, let me also thank Team iShow for considering this book for discussion in this important platform. I also want to thank Uday Kumar and Rochelle, who are also my teachers and, if I could say, friends, for agreeing to discuss this book. The book, as Rega said, is an attempt to develop a new approach of reading to the early novels written in Malayalam in the last 2 decades of 19th century. Now, my approach has been to highlight some of the historic specificity of these novels. Now, when we begin to read the novel, early novels, probably in other languages as well, one of the starking features of the early novel is that it doesn't have generic stability that we are mostly familiar of. There is no plot that unifies the narrative. There are quite a lot of things that really are not forming any kind of what we may call narrative coherence. There is no one story that, there of course may be one story, but quite a lot of elements, contemporary social issues, language debates, etc., inhabit in the narrative space of the early novel. That is one thing that immediately we recognize when we start reading the early novel. Now, how do we, the larger question I try to explore in this book is how do we actually see it as a sign of the kind of changes that came together in 19th century, we conceptually call as modernity. And if it could be seen two things actually. One is if we could see the literary writings itself as a social historical event rather than seeing it as a representation of the larger changes that is happening outside. That is one thing. The other one is how to move away from the kind of predominant literary approaches that single out certain books as important or proper novel, etc., etc. Now, once we recognize this particular character of the novel, that it's also a mixture of writings, mixture of genre, etc., etc., I really wanted to see what I was trying to relate see the early or literary formations of late 19th century, what we may call modern literary formation, in relation to the emergence of the new print culture. So to start with, I try to really look around, some of the early periodicals of the time, and wanted to see what kind of forms were being written in those periodicals. So I collected all the editions of one particular periodical called Vidya Vinodini, started in 1889 and went on to publish till 1903. And I tried to read, I came across a long historical piece, we may call it, called Adi Kerala Charitra, or History of Early Kerala. Now, when I read that, it announces itself as a historiography or history, but it was nothing of the sort that we today are familiar with. It is a combination of philology, mythology, historiography, communitarian concerns, etc., etc. By and large, it's a communitarian history, which is understandable because it is at that time that social reformative movements and attempts to forge community identity was also simultaneously happening in Kerala. Now, once I realized that this seems to be more or less the character of the prose poems written at that point of time, in the sense that they do not have any kind of genre stability, whether it is historiography, whether it is novel. So is the case with short stories written at that point of time. When I familiarized myself with more forms of writing, I realized that prose poems, like essay also, did not have that kind of nature that we today identify with. The essays did not only look like essay. Sometimes it is it includes within its writing, within its narrative space, poetry or verse forms, and also sometimes something that's look more like a fictional writing. That the fiction non-fiction distinction was not very clear and distinct there. Now, primary interest, it's not as if I was only interested in 19th century literary writing. Primarily, I was interested in knowing or understanding what we call modernity in new ways, and if novel could be the site to do that. That was my concern, and some of the conceptions that we have about what is modern was not actually available there. I mean, surely one could say that new things were happening there, but the kind of conception that we have about what is new was very different. With the kind of conception that I approached the 19th century, I mean the location left me with quite a lot of surprises. So one had to really think what was actually happening there, even when one recognizes it as new, that way modern. Now, so I really wanted to know what was then that, I became more curious about that space and tried to map the entire 19th century print space, right from the early 19th century till the last decades of 19th century. And then I realized that actually in the earlier phases, in the first half of 19th century, predominantly the print space controlled and driven by Christian missionaries, CMS Press, Basel Mission, etc., etc. The print space or the kind of writings that came at that point of time were far more stable than the kind of things that we encounter in the last decades of 19th century. They are initially in the first half of 19th century. They are religious in orientation, Christian missionary works, but they are pure prose forms that we get to see there. it is in the second half of 19th century that things begin to change. It is then that what we may call non-missionary locals and lack of a better term, let's call it natives enter into the print space and take actually control over it. It is then that the writings begin to acquire this particular character of having a kind of unstable nature. So commonsensically, we would think that in the beginning it was all unstable and then it stabilizes. That did not happen there. When we map the 19th century space, that is what we get to see. Now, that recognition actually led me to think, how do we think about this particular and maybe an unusual term of development. Now, I realized that, okay, this is what was happening, but I still did not know a way to begin to talk about the novel. Now, I think that was the most frustrating and most difficult phase of my work. This work is a revision of revised version of the thesis that I submitted in Delhi University for my PhD in 2015. So close to one and a half years, I was struggling actually how to. There was this recognition, but I really did not know how to find an entry point, if I could say that. Then I realized that probably this issue, I was struggling with this issue of tradition, modern, binary, which is probably driving my way of looking at things. I was trying to distinguish between what was new, what was old, whether old was actually, whether novel was an attempt to move away from the old and to produce something more new. And precisely because it was a prose form, it was readily identified as a sign of literary modernity as well. Now, it is then that, I mean, that long period of struggle that I began to slowly take into consideration variety of verse forms that actually populated or had a very strong presence in the writings, even in the prose forms. And in actually in verse forms itself in the last decades of 19th century. And we know that it is then that the novel began to make its appearance. In the novel, we can see early novels. There is rarely any novel written in 19th century without verse form. Some of the novels begin the chapter with a verse, ends with the verse, quotations, large number of quotations from classical texts, etc., can be seen. Then I began to explore more that particular culture, that particular. I was thinking what was it doing there, and why people were actually using this verse form. And they were not easy to decipher. They were clearly not modern poetry or even poetry. I realized when I was exploring more and more about the culture that news reports were written, editorials were written in verse. Letters used to be exchanged in verse. Literary criticism, book review were written in verse. Variety of things. It is then that I realized that it is not prose that is can only be seen as sign of modernity, and that is what is stopping probably us from really recognizing what was new about that period. It is in the and verse cannot be seen as sign of a residual culture or old culture or traditional practice, etc. So a lot of new things was happening there. How else can we call a verse, a news report in verse form, other than recognizing it as something very new? So then I clearly tried to study and kind of recognition, or realization, I would say, that if we begin to look at prose sign as a sign of modernity and subjecting it to study modernity itself, we may fall. It is it, it is by doing that that this tradition modern binary is at work when we approach the 19th century, or traditional modern binary, which is a problem. We know that because it's both a precondition for modernity and a product of that. So we are implicated. That is the problem of that binary that we all know. We are already implicated with that within the project of modernity while trying to study it, and that can be problematic. And I realized that it is by focusing on prose and seeing those forms as old or traditional, that traditional modernity was at work. Once I realized, once I actually began to take notice and to take down the variety of things that verse form was put to use, then it actually allowed me to break free from that binary, and that was, I think, probably one major breakthrough I could do in the work. And that recognition also helped me to involve in some kind of productive speculative thinking, such as if this was the case, if verse, what we recognize as old is not just old, it is new, it is there that we need to really look closely and in detail in order to account for the newness that was happening at that point of time. I thought what could be the relationship between literary writing and literary discourse and literary practice. Whether they are distinct as it is today, in the sense we from a distance we make some literary comments and which we call critical discourse. Whether that kind of a distinction actually existed at that point of time, that was one thing that I looked in greater detail and realized that that distinction that we make today did not exist at that point of time. The border was very fuzzy. So was the border between literary discourse and non-literary discourse fuzzy. So these three things actually, with these three things, I could develop a frame to look at the novel in new way and look at each of its elements and in greater detail and finds its life outside. Come back to the novel and try to give it a new form of reading. So I'll just take a couple of more minutes in order to just articulate in some limited sentences what exactly is this work try to achieve. This focus, especially the focus on verse culture, has opened a new window to approach the early novel written in Malayalam in the 19th century. The novel's fuzzy borders, the less distinction they had from both other literary writings and non-literary, acquires a new significance now. These novels themselves can now be read as sign of a larger social and historical changes that were happening in Kerala rather than their representations in literary realm. After all, when the border of the literary is fuzzy, representation there cannot be taken at face value for interpretation, because there was no representation in the first place. Everything was on the surface. We really needed to begin to learn a way of speaking about it in greater, or some kind of commentary that we need to really ability to comment about that writing, which lies unconcealed in those writings. This is how the early novel becomes a good site to think about the newness of social formation affected by the print technology in the last decades of 19th century Kerala, because in the novel, changes that occurred in diverse fields in the print space came together and displayed themselves as such. This is also This is also the reason why the early Malayalam novel is a useful site for thinking about Kerala's modernity. The story I unfolded in this book about the newness of 19th century novel is also the story of a specific formation of modernity that emerged in Kerala at that time. This modernity included within its domain formations of diverse and new entities, social, political, cultural, linguistic, and literary. They shall not be seen as separate or as forming distinct modernities with their own constituency. Instead, they need to be seen as constituent element of a particular modernity shaped in the final decades of the 19th century. The story of this modernity is not hidden in the early novels when we approach them the way I did in this book, making it necessary for us to extract it using interpretive methods. It lies unconcealed in these texts. My approach in this book has been to look at these elements and seek the story within the larger space of Kerala's print culture, and then return to the novel and see how they work in these texts. I think I'll stop there and probably also listen to the discussions and try and respond to the questions and comments. Tarek, I am done. Mahmood, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, okay.
So
Rega is there or she's gone?
let me just try to get
Okay.
her.
Yeah, she's
Hello.
Rega, I finished my presentation.
I understand. I got it. The next speaker is Uday Kumar. He absolutely need no introduction. He's affiliated to JNU. He will speak. He will respond to Ashokan now.
Thank you, Rekha. Thank you. And thank you, Aisho, for organizing this and inviting me to participate in this. And thanks above all to Ashokan for writing this really beautiful book. It opens, I think it opens a fresh pathway into thinking about the history of the early novel in Malayalam and to think about questions of modernity in Kerala. And we know that the early novel in Indian languages was a major object of discussion in the 1990s. And some new ideas, new ways of thinking about it really came up at that time. And not always from literature departments. Some of it came from the social sciences, from people who were preoccupied with questions of modernity. Like, for example, Sudipto Kaviraj or Partha Chatterjee or people like that. And then towards the end of the 90s, you also find a lot of work in the literature departments beginning to happen. One sign of it is the collection Early Novels in India, which is edited by Meenakshi Mukherjee, and her own earlier work on the novel in India. Now, we know that most of these studies thought about the novel as indicating the moment of a break in literary culture, a break in imagination, a break in the space of language and public articulation, you could say. And at the same time, you also have the feeling that the early novels which come up in India did not really look like the English novels on which they were modeled, seemingly. There's something, some kind of divergence which often happens. There are poetry conventions, like Ashokan himself looks at the presence of verse forms in the novel. How do we understand this? And an early response to this was to think of them as kind of deficiency, like novel hasn't really come of age. It is still searching for a proper form. And these earlier forms of expression, whether it be poetic or other kinds of expressions, are kind of coming into the novel and assimilated. In that sense, these early novels were seen as kind of transitional. And in the late 90s, there was an attempt to revise these ideas. And Ashokan's work really takes that forward to a completely different level. I feel that he interrupts a kind of retrospective view of the early novel. That is a view of the early novel from the position of what the novel becomes later, and the early novel being seen as anticipating inadequately what it is going to become later. In contrast to this, Ashokan is interested in looking at these early novels as a positivity in themselves. And it is not a stable space, but that instability itself needs to be seen in positive terms, needs to be understood in positive terms. So here, I feel that the real boldness and originality of Ashokan's project is in the realization, in the insight that what is at issue in the novel, in some sense, is the issue of the literary, the notion of literature as we understand it now, and the insight that a history of the literary cannot really be written from within the framework of the discourse of literature. That is, if the discourse of literature, that is what we call the literary, is what we are trying to study, then you cannot actually write that by adopting a framework which presupposes its stability, which institutionalizes it. That will not allow us to see what was actually happening and how it came into existence. So this, I think, is an important idea. And the way in which Ashokan tries to do this is, I think, primarily in two ways. He explained this so very well and so clearly in his presentation. The first is actually to look at the space of print culture. And here, print culture in some sense displaces the centrality or seeming stability of the idea of the novel. And it also kind of brackets the question of the literary. We need to ask the question, what is literary, by first looking at the space of print from which it seems to emerge. This is, you could say, a first displacement. That is the displacement of the literary in favor of print culture. And secondly, there is a displacement he effects on the novel itself by focusing on elements or features which do not fit the concept of the novel. In other words, the space of the novel and its seeming stability are displaced by focusing on verse forms principally, and towards the end of the book, also on other kinds of discursive forms, like the debate, for example, the public discussion of ideas. These become central to Ashokan's investigation, and the novel now seems to be understood not in contrast to them, but in relation to them as a space where these things could be carried out. So these two kinds of displacements, first by giving prominence to the idea of print culture, and second to versification, and to a lesser extent, the other kinds of discursive forms like the debate and ideas. These are key to Ashokan's book. And so therefore, it's not accidental that we have two chapters, one focusing on print culture and one focusing on versification, in a book which has actually, apart from the introduction and conclusion, 4 substantive chapters. In other words, half of the book, you could say, is really effecting this displacement through which the question of the novel can be opened up. And Ashokan already summarized some of the key directions or orientations of his discussion of the print space. And what he showed us, in his presentation today is a kind of seeming stability of the print space in the mid-19th century, but then it seems to change. It becomes much more heterogeneous and unstable by the late 19th century. And that seems to be the space where the novel really emerges. Now, sometimes I wondered if the distinction, if there is a process at work there. Like, for example, Ashokan is right in saying that when we look at the earliest issues of Rajya Samacharam or Paschimodayam, the missionary publications, what we call the religious print publications, there seem to be a kind of seeming stability, so to say. But even that stability, if we look at it closely, one may say that it begins to get shaken by the mid-19th century. I'm thinking in particular of a translation of Pilgrim's Progress in 1849, I think, made by R.C. Muller, which Basel Mission publishes. And in that, you have a translation of Pilgrim's Progress with the names in the original being retained or being translated into Malayalam. But suddenly at one point, in the original, this is the place where the protagonist, Christian, reaches this place called Vanity Fair. And suddenly the scene changes and the characters and the place which is being described suddenly becomes located in Kerala. Like the people who are being referred to, who are allegorical personifications, come to be associated with caste names and caste stereotypes, and Malayali names begin to appear. And this continues for several pages before it returns to that earlier form. So even within the religious print publication, something seems to happen when certain new narrative forms come up. New narrative forms begin to get introduced, and when local communities seem to find a space in a discourse which is not about particular localities and which is presented at an allegorical plane of universality. Now, it's interesting that Pilgrim's Progress is often regarded as belonging to what modern literary historiography would call the prehistory of the novel. And in the context of Malayalam, we know that there are many texts of this kind, beginning with Pilgrim's Progress. Then, of course, we have Kathakavatham, and then the translation of a Bengali novel. These kinds of things begin to come. Now, Ashokan, one really interesting thing which I found in Ashokan's discussion of print is the way in which he uses biography as an important tool, looking at the biographies of some figures like Devji Premji, S.T. Reddy, Kandathil Varghese Mappila, and later on Kottarathil Shangunni, to track the variegated and connected nature of the evolution of the print public sphere and its relationship to networks, communities, a number of dispersed circles and locations. I think this kind of work probably needs to be taken up even more widely in the context of Kerala in order for us to recover a more detailed understanding of what is happening at that time in print. Like now there are studies on Makti Tangal beginning to come up, and publishers like Kunnangulathi Tupa, Malayalam, Kunyivari, the people like that who are very important in the publication of Adhyatma Ramayanam and some of the other texts, and who democratizes the publication by bringing the pricing low, etc., etc. So who are the readers and what is the extent of this print public sphere? Ashokan's work really inaugurates some interesting pointers for looking at that. And I hope that more such studies come up. And now in the case of the non-literary print public sphere, Ashokan already spoke about the Adi Kerala Charitram, which he discusses in detail. And again, there probably we need an account along the lines which he has done for other kinds of genres like petitions, newspapers, government publications, various kinds of public writing, which gets printed. What is happening at that time? As we will see, this becomes important for some of the problems and issues he raises in relationship to the novel form and its connection with debate, social issues, etc. Now, Ashokan already pointed out that versification and verb played a very central place there. And he points our attention to a situation where newspaper editors could not find reporters who could actually send their reports in prose. They could, many of them could only send it in the shlokam form, that is in the verse form. Now, it may appear very strange to us. Why is it that people who are, of course, speaking prose all the time, why is it that they could not write a report in prose? Why is it that editorials could not be written in prose? Now, this also tells us that what is at issue there is a certain ability or capacity for a public use of language. That is, you may be able to speak, of course, in prose all through the day, but when you have to address an anonymous public, a new idea of the public which is beginning to emerge with print, there seems to be a problem. People seem to prefer versification. So we also need to understand the novel in relationship to a new avenue, a new genres of public utterance which are coming up at that time. And the presence of words also needs to be seen, like Ashokan points out, as a feature of this, what we call a modern space of incipient publicness, which is arriving at that time. Now, I will be brief, and I will try to kind of wind up my comments by pointing to 2 or 3 elements, and then I'll stop. One is the question of tradition and modernity, about which Ashokan already has spoken quite a bit. And there, we know that in the context of a particular self-consciousness of modernity, which in Kerala has often been spoken about under the sign of Navothanam. And Ashokan's book begins with some discussions of 21st century or 20th century thinkers revisiting the moment of Navothanam. Navothanam also produces a peculiar concept of tradition. This is the idea of a tradition is also accompanied by the idea that the tradition has declined or it has stopped becoming a source of fresh energies. There is a need for newness. Yeah? So tradition is not simply what is old, but something which is old also because it has run out of steam. It is no longer present and relevant. This idea of tradition begins to come up. And a lot of the criticism of tradition which is being made in short stories, in essays, in novels, in this period, is also which assimilates tradition with, as Ashokan points out, certain kinds of stupidity and certain kinds of ignorance. Yeah? And this ignorance or ineptness comes from the idea of tradition not really being a live one. People are merely parroting, imitating, without knowing the meaning of what they are doing, etc., etc. Now, this idea of tradition is an interesting thing to look at. And what we call tradition itself is in some sense reliant on 2 ideas. One is what we may call archiving, and the other is citationality, like the way in which you quote shlokams. Aptavakyam, shlokam, these things are cited. So an idea of citationality is very, very important here. And one might even want to think whether this particular idea of tradition, which really comes up at that time, is thinkable without the idea of print and the possibility of print documenting things, organizing things, making them available for citation. Now, Ashokan, in the later part of the book, discusses heterogeneous discursive elements coming into the novel, like debate, the 18th chapter of Indulekha, these kinds of features. And he correctly refers us to the diverse nature of the print sphere at that time. That these are actually not deficiencies. These actually tell us something about the print space at that time. Now, there are many things to be said about this, and this particular space of print and the heterogeneous character and the double valence of many of the utterances which are being made in the novel has a relationship to what you may call um, uh, the nature of the literary at that time. The literary seems to be, on the one hand, making some claims of being a separate kind of space, which needs to be evaluated according to what one may call aesthetic norms. But on the other hand, whatever is said in the literary space is also a public utterance, and it is prone to the same kinds of problems, injuries, hurt, anger, etc., that all public utterances are prone to. And the novel really flourishes in the space of this ambivalence, so this heterogeneity. And I feel that what Ashokan inaugurates by looking at these unusual features of debate, etc., can and needs to be extended to a large number of other forms and other community locations which are also live in Kerala at that time. Now, he also makes a contrast, presents a contrast or comparison between two kinds of aesthetic normativity of the novel. One which he associates with the moment of Vidya Vinodini, where some Sanskrit ideas like kavyam, for example, are getting redefined, and the prioritization of Arthalangaram against Shabdalangaram. Through this, a kind of literary aesthetic is being created. And this is not really a translation. But we also know that alongside this, there are prefaces written by people like Chandamenon, letters written by, comments being made by people like C.V. Ramanpilla, which do not really invoke a stable aesthetic. They also try to index something that is new, which is coming up. Like Chandamenon, as we know, found that in a new kind of painting which is happening at that time, and a new use of ordinary language which is coming up at that time. So these are also important to see how the aesthetics, the different strands of aesthetics which come up at that time eventually lead to the creation of a stable, seemingly stable novelistic critical apparatus by the 1930s. Now, one of the things which Ashokan's book does not really actively engage with, but which can really be important as a continuation of the ideas which he opens up, is really about the representation of communities in the novel, caste communities in the novel. And Adi Kerala Charitram is very interesting there. Now, how does caste become speakable and unspeakable within the public domain? And there, I think, looking at the early novel shows us some very, very interesting pointers. There are a lot of early novels which are also self-consciously speaking about caste communities or assuming the identity of caste communities. Yeah? But at the same time, there is also a way in which the novel is attempting to conduct a project of ethnography in some sense by presenting a world from within a caste community, but at the same time attempting a representation of the social which goes beyond the idea of diverse caste communities. So on the one hand, a particular world of a caste community with the diversities within that, but on the other hand, the novel also seems to be telling a story from outside the world of the social, about the world of the social. So here, how does speaking about caste communities in our public utterances become possible, and how does it get attenuated as we go along towards the 1930s is an interesting point to think more about. So once again, thank you, Ashokan, for writing this wonderful book, and I look forward to Rochelle's comments and the discussion. Thank you.
Now I request Ms. Rochelle Pinto to speak.
Thank you. Can I start now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to thank Aisho for inviting me to do this, and Ashokan as well. I really enjoyed reading this text. Since Uday has done such a wonderful job as usual of contextualizing this broadly within the field of 19th century novel studies, I have actually focused on Ashokan's text, and I've tried to note down some of the aspects which struck me and which I thought, the contribution that he's made to the field of print history and specifically 19th century print in India. I've tried to examine those aspects. So I did think that the book had an economy of expression and a dynamism that I hope will help it find a larger audience than most academic books do. It proves at the beginning that all history is a history of the present. When it compares two histories of 19th century Kerala, Govind Pillai's book of 2003 and contrasts it to the perspective of E.M.S. Namboodiripad. Ashokan tells us that Pillai's book does not overtly emphasize the destructive effect of colonialism. Instead, the increase in the circulation of communal perspectives in Kerala in the contemporary alters the perspective on the past. Another aspect that is striking in this comparison is that Namboodiripat's text does not necessarily oppose tradition and modernity, as we often find in writing about other parts of India, but argues for what is specific about the modernity of Kerala in contrast to colonial modernity. This reinforces how important it is for us to have histories such as Ashokan's, which are particular to their context, as this helps us understand concepts and the processes through which they have arisen, so that we can have a narrative about ourselves that has not merely borrowed truisms from elsewhere. On the other hand, it must also be emphasized that Ashokan does not make an exceptionalist argument for Kerala, which blocks it off from other possible comparative work. I find an invigorating methodological rigor in the work, which can benefit the writing of literary history. By using the appearance of Sanskrit verse in late 19th century print as a prism, Ashokan sustains an argument that reveals to us that a change in literary language signals a simultaneous change in a broader epistemological culture. 19th century literary writing contains many aspects that can be confusing, often because literary history, as Uday has already pointed out, approaches it using categories that apply in fact to 20th century phenomena. Thus, it would be easy to see the appearance of verse in novels and in newspapers as a form of literary continuity, as an inability to change, or as a desire for tradition. Ashokan's analysis is most useful in the way it patiently sets aside these possibilities. He argues instead that a separation of prose from poetry is in itself a constitutive process of modernity, signaling a change in the use of language and genre. By consistently separating literary discourse from literary writing and literary history, he offers us several distinctions that will be very useful for the practice of the literary history of the 19th century. He describes, for instance, how oral and oral cultural practices extended into print, or how a Sanskrit literary space was created within a 19th century play. He does not describe these elements only as a remnant or a continuation of an earlier tradition in a new space. Instead, he allows them their own temporal specificity and nature by recognizing that there is a newness to their appearance in a different genre. A newness that alters the genre and the cultural meaning of the element itself, whether it is verse, an alliterative pattern, or a rhyme scheme. It is a relief to have such detailed and painstaking analysis developed across each chapter, written in a manner that makes for easy reading. The argument, too, is built gradually and with a clarity that I hope will attract many readers. This is most evident in a discussion across around page 78 and 79, which almost anchors the book. This is a description of two menins discussing the absence of rhyme in a shlokam that precedes a novel. Their conversation is overheard by their domestic help, who, being unfamiliar with literary signs, mistakes the word for a syllable for a scrubbing brush and runs to fetch one. However, the servant's misunderstanding or ignorance is not the point of this account. Instead, the two men who fetishize formal symmetry over significance are seen to represent an undesirable literary culture. Ashokan cites the writer Achyuta Menon, who states that only when form and meaning are in consonance can literary finesse be achieved. Such statements indicate how a literary field countenanced or articulated its encounter with change. In particular, I thought the discussion of rasa and the consideration of whether works that were not in verse could be said to possess rasa was also another kind of indication of how an epistemological and a literary field was reorganizing itself and the kind of challenge that it presented to literary theorists. And I thought that was something actually that Ashokan, given the kind of material he had collected, could probably continue working on. The chapters on print types and the alphabet, or the second syllable in a rhyme scheme, which he presents in great detail, provide the kind of rich detail that ground this work. And actually, they are, I think, a repository in themselves for future scholars to take forward. These details also serve as the beginning of an arc that stretches from the material aspects of language to literary abstractions, across which the author is able to sustain his argument about literature and modernity. I end here with perhaps a question, to Ashokan, perhaps to consider, I really enjoyed the way in which you actually acknowledged all the various critical works that had been written on Indulekha, while also offering your own argument against some of them and taking into account some of them. And I thought perhaps you could also think about how novelistic forms, so even while we note the incorporation of forms that traditionally we may not see as belonging within a novel, and you note how they disrupt the flow of the novel. I also wondered whether the sections that we might see as more conventional also in some way are modified to house these sections. So for instance, is there a way in which Indulekha spatially makes place for these chapters that are informative prose? Or are there attributes of novelistic prose that also shift within Indulekha so that in order to form a kind of bracket or a formal bracket for the sections that we see drawing more clearly from legal history? The one other question I had was in relation to your assertion that in a developed literary field, there's usually a kind of a separation between literary discourse and literary writing. And I thought actually maybe that the overlapping of the two is a device that writers use often. And perhaps, I think we might find this even in literary fields that we may see as developed, where perhaps there is a stability of genre. But perhaps the overlapping of discourse and literary writing occurs whenever somebody wants to signal change. So that may occur in an early print sphere in colonial India, but we may also see it happening perhaps as the late 20th century novel begins to turn. So I'd like to stop here, and I'm sure there are other questions and responses. Thank you again.
Hi. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes, Rekha, we can hear you. Yeah.
Now I request Ashokan to respond to the comments in the blog.
You
Hello?
want me to respond now to Uday and Rochelle?
Yeah. The comments.
Okay, yeah. Maybe I'll try and respond to some of the points that Uday and Rochelle raised. That not very sure how adequately I'll be able to respond to some of this A couple of important points both of them have raised. To Uday suggestion that one actually has to really relook the assumption that the what I in maybe in a hurried manner called the religious print space of the early 19th century, that there is a seeming stability to it. In works such as Pilgrim's Progresses, uh, translation, they really that I mean that assumption doesn't sustain such when we look in greater details such writings. Uh, Actually, I really believe that I try to map as you know, everybody should know this. Uday Kumar is the one who supervised this thesis, and yeah, I mean I gained a great deal from his careful supervision. Yeah, I think that quite. I mean, it's as you know, it's my focus has been late last 2 decades of 19th century, and yeah, maybe I think 1860s onwards, one really needs to study those forms of writing that are that you suggested, such as the translation of the Bengali novel and Pilgrim Progress. And also, I mean, what comes to my mind is also this translation of Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare's play by Kandathil Varghese Mapla, in which a similar instance occurs. That it's in the preface, it's more local Kerala with people who are sounding more local, and then in the main play, it's more of a Sanskrit literary thing. I was actually much later recently trying to study that particular play, Taming of the Shrew, translated as Kalahini Damnagam, and was trying to think about some of the issues I've not fully explored in this particular book. Probably it opens up new ways of thinking about these things, and I really need to study in greater detail 19th century and also the period that precedes the last 2 decades of 19th century. Yeah, I think one really has to do that work. Now, the other question is more crucial, which is that of the question of communities and the question of caste. I mean, the thesis actually was titled Print Communities and the Novel in 19th Century. And when I began this work, I was more confident about the study community formations. Then I became more confident about print. I was less confident about the novel, and eventually it so happened that I could speak more about the novel. And then I realized that that particular aspect, the question of community, which is very, very crucial, the question of caste and communities is not fully explored to be actually, which could become part of the title. Somewhere it remains less under less studies, less explored. Again, I think that's an important thing that I must try to study in greater detail and with the kind of seriousness that it demands. One thing I would like to add is, I mean, this is my own sense and partly my own confusion about when thinking about how to go about how to take some of the questions which I raised in this book forward. Is also what happens in the 1930s. So this particular idea of the modernity that I try to develop, I believe is something that occurs between 1880s and 1930s. And from 1930s, there seems to be a very significant shift. And the idea of Navothanam that shapes our understanding of modernity today very strongly, especially when we talk about Kerala, seems to deal with the kind of changes that occurred in Kerala from 1880 to probably till 1930s. So there is more normative understanding of what it ought to be and what is there. So uh, uh, the idea of tradition is what often what we assign as or designate as tradition is something that was new. That's something that shaped itself as new in this particular time. So there is constantly, I felt that today in Kerala, in the specifically in the discourses of Navothanam, the kind of exceptionalist claim that that I think everybody is familiar of is emerges or it is also an attempt to deal with this contradiction between what it ought to be or say pick up signs of certain things that conforms to it and the wide variety of practices that are new but may not conform to our own idea of what today modern is. So there is some kind of a contradiction, I think, from 1930s that society by and large trying to come to terms with or articulate, or probably from this contradiction, irresolvable kind of contradiction that these discourses are emerging. And yeah, that is one thing I really wanted to say, apart from the responding to the probably two things I thought requires some kind of response. Yeah. And yeah, maybe also something about this question of tradition. So once I also really feel that we need to really explore and what exactly is this thing called tradition and what configures itself as tradition at various times. And once we designate something as tradition, we either say that this is something that requires change or something that doesn't make itself easily available for critical scrutiny. So, or something that makes itself available only for criticism from the modern point of view, rather than critical scrutiny. So, one thing I'm increasingly becoming interested in is the question of tradition. Not that I'm traditionalist, I uphold traditional values, but what exactly are these things? Variety of things, and there seems to be quite a lot of practices, everyday practices that are alive, lively, and people participate in a great deal. What we call tradition, I mean, and develop an ability to speak about it, understand it, much more useful fashion than the way in which we see them. Okay, Rochelle, thank you, Rochelle, for saying all those things that you said. And yeah, with regard to the question of Rasa, and that, I mean, I was trying actually, when I was looking at it, I was trying to see what Achyuta Menon was actually trying to do. So much later, this is something which I am trying to recognize more recently, that it's not, as you said, it's not an attempt to translate. It is some kind of, it clearly is an attempt to develop a literary discourse suitable for Malayalam literature, which is emerging now. But I think that in such writings, we also see a kind of challenge that people who are involved or producers of such discourses often encounter. In the sense, how do we, in the face of these changes and require or felt a requirement to develop things, including literary critical discourses suitable for the time, what exactly gets developed. And sometimes it works very well. Sometimes it doesn't get, sometimes certain things require to be discarded in the sense I was also looking at the way in which days of the week are produced in Malayalam. And it seemed that, there was a lot of difficulty to identify the days of the week as it is arranged today. In Malayalam, it is Nyayar Tingal, so Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I'm not able to recollect exactly where I saw, but those who were trying to really do that was unable to align clearly with it, because Tuesday came, or what is referred to as Tuesday, immediately following Tuesday came not Wednesday, but Friday and Saturday. And there were some kind of a struggle. Those people were involved in trying to align with or produce something which is in alignment with the new world. Certain things worked, but certain things did not work. I think that is how this many things that we call tradition also fall out of it. And then I'm really thinking through those things in order to conceive this idea of modern as an everyday thing that we live in our life. I'm sorry if I'm not articulating this thing very clearly, but yeah, I was thinking about those things. Say, for example, numbers becoming. What is modern about it? The days of the week is modern. We know it. It is in alignment with the universal ideas of the week. But there was a lot of struggle initially to develop that. Sometimes there is an alignment, sometimes there is no alignment. And what it falls out of alignment, say, for example, astrology, they have a very strong life elsewhere. But what exactly is that? What do people do with it, and things like that? Yeah, and the other question about novelistic forms, which in those spaces in narrative spaces which looks more in alignment with the modern law now, or the kind of familiarity that we have. Whether it is so is a question that I really need to ask and look at. I was more focused on the question of what was visibly literary and non-literary, what was visibly literary, critical, and literary practice and literary discourse, literary writing and non-literary writing. If a quick response to the question that it followed, whether how about in many historical times, when such practices exist, or say, for example, things like breaking the fourth wall, etc., etc. I think 19th century, since these two things were simultaneously emerging in the imagination of the writers, the distinction did not exist. It was not as a conscious attempt to break the distinction. What today we call as postmodern novels, etc., where that genre there is a conscious effort to break the genre form and then making it many things at the same time. Then it was different. It was I would still call it modern, and modern that modern is not the way in which we understand it now. That is the stable space. If I'm answering that question, addressing that question properly, that is how I understood it. But the other thing I really need to relook. I have to go back to the novel and see how in spaces that looks more stable. How do we relook at those elements of writing which are in conformity to our own understanding of them?
Thank you, Ashokan. Now it's time to Q&A. We welcome all queries, discussions, inputs on the discussion. We could take 10 to 15 minutes for this session.
Maybe I'll start with a sort of question. But before that, it's really wonderful to listen to the discussion on the book from Professor Uday Kumar and Professor Rochelle Pindo. And I very much look forward to reading the book. Again, congratulations on getting it published, Ashokan. Couple of things, basically, on the basis of the discussion that we had and the comments that Rochelle and Uday Kumar made on the book. Two things. One is on the, you mentioned the idea of verse culture as an important element in the 19th century. And I wonder, despite of the prominence of the verse culture, and this is something that I also see, for example, in the Arabic Malayalam print culture in the 18th and not print culture in the 18th century, but definitely in the Arabic Malayalam literary production in the 18th century, as well as in the print culture in the 19th century and up to mid 20th century, the verses or the poems are the most prominent ones compared to the prose ones. But specifically with regard to the novels, I wonder why, the prose ones became more successful later on. Does it have anything to do with the technology of reading or even printing? That is one. And similarly, Professor Uday mentioned the centrality of biography as in the evolution of print and the consequential making of probably a public audience or public sphere. And I'm curious again, coming from the familiarity with the Arabic Malayalam tradition, that's something that I see quite a lot of all the, all sort of different biographies of not necessarily people from within the region, but also from all over. And there are these biographies of, women whom otherwise you don't know at all. If we do not have access to these books in the, these books, these biographies which accidentally survived possibly. So I wonder in the print culture itself, to what extent these were mutually contributing to one another. The making of the biography as again comparatively successful genre, as well, like, is it built on the print culture, or how the relationship between biographies as an important form in the 19th and 20th century. Yeah. But again, once again, congratulations, and I look forward to reading the book.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Yeah, to the first question, how, I mean, yes, I understand it. Are you asking me how, despite emerging itself in a very predominantly verse culture, eventually it stabilized itself as a prose form, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so okay, there are two things here. One is that I try to move away from this idea that in the late 19th century that shift happened, shift from verse to prose, and I'm trying to suggest that that did not happen in the last decades of 19th century when the novel form emerged. The novel form, as we know, emerged with its clearly in the colonial context, in that familiarity with the form in the western part of the world. So it did not. We cannot say it is something that is purely originally produced in the local culture. So it came, its familiarity initially itself as a prose form. By 19th century, we know that novel is a very well developed form in the western part of the world. It is that novel that 19th century writers were familiar with. And when they tried to read it, when they actually tried writing it, they had quite a lot of difficulties. Say, for example, description of locations, description of body, certain things, they would resort to certain the two words form because there was no. These are stylistic issues. Uday Kumar in a couple of works, especially on the early novel, actually talks about it in greater detail. How this way of seeing, reading, way of seeing, and way of conceiving it, and way of in the process of writing, one how that slipping into some of the some of the thing with which you originally claim to write. Say, for example, Chandu Menon wanted to write the novel in a more ordinary Malayalam that is spoken at that point of time, and we know that it takes recourse to quite a lot of Sanskrit literary styles. Yeah, so in the first place, it is understood as a prose form. Now, much later, how it stabilized, this verse culture that we see in 19th century is also because of the non-print literate, strong non-print literate culture that existed at that point of time. So those who were literate, those who were, let's call it educated, so educated in a non-print culture. Yeah. Once print stabilizes itself or spreads itself, then there is a gradual shift towards the prose. I may be hurrying in my conclusion of this, but not as if the verse completely makes a disappearance. It stays, but it stays quite a lot of places where they don't. It stays in places where we may not immediately recognize as literary, etc. Say, for example, by 1930s, we don't really see literary criticism happening. There may be some, but the most prominent writings that emerged in the 1930s in people's books are all in prose, and by that time, this normative idea of what modern literature is came into being, and there was some kind of a self-consciousness that had to be written in prose. Actually, there is an interesting story in the 1920s when A.D. I'm forgetting his name, the guy who wrote the biography of Kandathil Varghese Mapilla, when he wanted to write, get some materials on Varghese Mapilla, he writes a letter to Kottarathil Samuni in verse. He was very old by that time. He says that I wrote to him not because I was confident in writing letter in verse, but since he belonged to the traditional culture of exchanging writing letters in verse, I thought this will create an interest in him and he may respond positively. Now, Kottarathil Samani just writes one line in prose saying that I'm sorry, I can't help you. I don't know much material. So there is actually a shift actually at that point of time. So this is clearly related to the question of print, new ideas of modern, that the normative idea of modern that is emerging. So I think as time goes on and the 20th century, later or third decades of 19th century, I think there is a clear shift. The other question, biography, I think I'll forward it to Uday Kumar. I am not, I really do not. I have not looked at biography the way in which I think you are looking at it. I don't have that ability to speak.
Yeah.
I
Can I come in? Yeah.
1 second.
Actually,
Just,
sorry. Yeah, sure.
yeah. I was looking at biographical details available. S.T. Reddyar. I was not looking at biography. I'm not looking at biographical articulations. I was looking only at I was actually giving biographical details, not studying. Study. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
But sir,
They-
Yeah.
they-
Yeah, what I wanted to say at that time was that organizing that chapter, print chapter, and one section you really look at these three individuals, and that I thought was a very interesting way of doing it. I was also not speaking about biographies, but biography as a kind of method for looking at print, individuals.
Yeah.
That I think is a very, very productive, thing, I think.
Oh my God. Thank you so much. I think there are two questions in the chat.
You want me to look at? Okay.
Or I can also read it out. One is from Rosemary. Could you please throw some light on the book cover, the visual elements in the book cover?
Rosemary, I had no much choice there. It's the publisher gave me three choices, and I thought this was okay. This was one among the best, and really did not think conceptually or had any much scope in saying that this could change or something else. There were three covers that was given to me for choosing, and the editor also liked that. Then I said, okay. I had no say in it, so I really
Okay.
do not have anything specific to say about it. Yeah. Umar, intrigued by the immediate nature of many of the components. Okay, that I think is a comment.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
So other questions? Inputs?
Anamika,
Yeah, some
you mentioned about
questions in the inbox. Yeah.
and print ventures. I was wondering if the serialization of Malayalam novels happens missionary periodicals. If yes, I was wondering if the novel can be called a novel. I think Khadagavadam was serialized in one in what is the title of the periodical? Yeah, something has happened to my memory, and Khadagavadam was actually serialized, and the didactic nature, of course, was there. Recreational, I believe that that elements also was there. For example, when we look at Parangodi Baranayam, the idea of that will actually come up. If the novel can be called more of a recreational. I have not actually looked at, asked that question if they were recreational in nature or didactic in nature. I was trying to look at the kind of public presence they were attempting to make. I think that is what I was trying to do. Speculative and perhaps slightly. Okay. I am curious if there are aspects of mixed genre space of print, the formation of a new literary practice, educational practices, which made you think of a contemporary digital space, new ways. The formation of a new literary practices. Okay, about our contemporary digital space, I think we are also in the kind of technological transition or transition that is driven by technological shift of a much larger scale and a very specific thing happening in our own time. And I've not really thought through this, but sometimes I believe that this issue of the variety of things, new things that are happening, coming together as causing sometimes excitement, sometimes perplexity. I mean, the kind of changes that we can see at a time in 19th century when there is a spread and stabilization of print culture. Variety of things are coming together. Variety of new things are coming together, and I think we sometimes our own anxiety is because of those proliferation of new things and inability to deal with them. And yeah, I think probably it might help us to think about some of the changes within which we are living and trying to deal with in our own time. But I think this is far more. This is clearly the digital shift is far more and has the kind of implications and very, very different, but probably some certain things. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a clear answer for that, but yeah. Yes.
Any questions?
No more questions.
I have a
No,
quick question.
Yeah, Sridevi has to.
Yeah, so congratulations,
Sridevi.
Ashokan, on this. And
Hello, Sridevi. How are
yes,
you?
yeah, yeah, I'm good. And it was really nice and interesting to hear from you. And so one of the question that I have is, again, since you were talking about versification and what if we come across these sort of verses in scattered in between in the science writings as well? uh, in that period, because it started as a prose form, right? Unlike any creative part, because some of the print articles and which I came across again in Vidya Vinodini and all that has this, even in the science writings and technology writings also you have, which we have also discussed earlier, in terms of 4 lines in between or beginning with a verse and then you go into technology and then again and you conclude it with the verse, etc. So like how do we sort of
Sridevi, you are
I
there?
think,
You have
I
disappeared.
think her network has gone.
Oh,
We'll wait for some time.
okay.
yeah, sorry if I
Yeah.
yeah, so this is what I had in mind, like when it comes
Yeah.
in terms of prose writings like science and technology
Okay.
writings.
So, I mean, quick response to that is that we have to see both of them as new. I mean, we have a tendency to look at, say, for example, I remember reading some essays on economy, what is money, etc., etc. And also technological developments like uh, what is that short story in which Vengal Kunjiraman Nayanar describes a great detail about this new uh, tool developed in order to dive into the sea. Sorry, I'm just forgetting again that particular thing that was developed, and there is a description of it. I mean, my quick response to that is that on the one hand, we have to see these new writings or new ideas that are being articulated in Malayalam as new, because self-evidently they are new. They are technology and more contemporary. But the worst thing that is there as a citation, and precisely because it is one is that it is used for a new purpose, we have to see it as we shouldn't see it as some kind of an appearance or breaking of the modern into a traditional form and struggling with. So I try to see these practices as new altogether rather than as a kind of tussle between new and the old, which the writing subject is trying to come to grapple. Yeah. So in the novel, when I say, for example, in the novel, when I see verse form, I look at the new life it acquires in when it gets printed in the novel, which is predominantly a non-print literate culture, literate form. It's supposed to be recalled from memory and said, which is also seen as a sign of Vidwan, the knowledge, the knower or something like that. But once it gets printed, it gets circulated, it appears in prose form, etc., etc. These clearly are signs of new. That is also the reason why I use the term new rather than modern. Modern can create a lot of confusion because it's come with a lot of baggage. We have certain conceptual already formed conceptualization of what the modern is. So once you see what is new about the thing that were happening, even those things that look little suspicious when we look for new things. Okay. I hope I address that question.
Yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you.
Yeah. Niyati is asking, as discussed, there is a lack of representation when it comes to the subaltern in the novel of the modernity period. So how is it that a researcher can address this all throughout the study while considering this text that have an important lacking? Representation of the subaltern, there are novels which actually, as you know, Saraswati Vijayam actually takes up the question of the caste community very strongly. So question of representation is, of course, is there. It's not as if the subaltern subject or the overcast question or question of caste is even in what we may identify as mainstream novel or written by. The question of community is very strong. I really couldn't do enough justice to it. That is why it is there in the book, which requires further development and clearer articulation. The kind of literary culture I study clearly is a kind of exclusive terrain. I'm not saying that members of the lower caste had strong presence there. In the literary, what is called, literary column that Kandathil Varghese Mappila, for example, Kavita Bhakti, started in his newspaper Malayalam Manorama, we see quite a lot. He actively encourages people from a variety of communities to come and participate in the literary field. But by and large, this is clearly dominant communities who are also trying to become active members of the emerging actors of the emerging literary field. But I feel that we need to study that in greater detail if we have to really need to really understand the kind of social formation that happened at that time. That merely because it is excluded we cannot set aside from critical scrutiny. It's also because it is exclusive in a certain sense, it requires a kind of serious analysis and scrutiny. Okay.
So you have two comments in the inbox.
Deepika. Okay.
Deepika
talks about the hermetic aesthetics in connection with the colonial modernity. I don't know what does that actually. I'm not able to understand what it means. Hermetic aesthetic. If you can actually tell me what it means, then I'll be able to speak about it. Colonial modern aesthetics. I don't really know. Deepika, I'm sorry, I'm not able to understand that question. Yeah.
Deepika, you want to ask questions directly other than this?
Deepika, yeah, I think that will be useful. Renu also said that she had a question, but the question is not asked.
Yeah, I would. Can I ask the question?
Renu, yes.
Yeah. So I'm more familiar with the early modern, the medieval literary forms in Kerala. And, because at one point you said the verse form is not a residue from the past. But I was thinking, when the poetic mode was really dominant in Kerala, it was used for writing history or writing scientific material, mathematical treatises, pretty much for everything. So this one mode was, the verse form was, kind of widely used, but for different purposes. And here it seems novel is a new form and prose is maybe becoming more dominant literary form. And there you again see the same mode being used, kind of for different things. The verse is also in it as a kind of, because it was something that was very widely used maybe till the 18th century. It kind of makes its way into this new form, which is the novel form. So in that sense, it seems like something of the old has remained or is a continuity from that, this, I'm not saying it's tradition, modernity, that kind of difference, but, considering that the verse form was so dominant in Kerala.
Yeah. No, there is no doubt that it is part of that tradition, that the practice of and developed a kind of practice, literate practice developed in a non-print culture, aiding memory, because one had to really memorize everything. It had to be produced in the non-writing domain. You have to really remember the entire text and then recite them. So citation is one of the, not just production, but also citation is one of the most important practices of the time. So all I'm trying to suggest is that it would be wrong if we look at it only as residual and survival. Because if we see it only as residual, we won't be able to understand how to look at the things like writing a literary criticism or, say, for example, review of a particular book that has come to being, which is new, writing editorial in a newspaper, writing news story in verse, etc., etc., as residual. It is not. It is new, and that newness stays only in that, predominantly stays only in that last 2 decades. So there is something new that is shaping up now, which disappears, which did not exist. I would say did not exist before, because it is shaping in the print world. So there is connection between this and the spread of new technology. We cannot see it as separate. So once we see that two things in relation to the print stabilization or spread, and inception and spread of print technology, we will be able to identify something which has emerged itself now and then will make a disappearance of a variety of things. It was not just one thing, a variety of things. So an active encouragement by, say, for example, Kandathil Varghese Mapla to write verses about new objects that are coming up, such as museum, etc., etc. So it's a range of new things are happening. That newness is something which we may not be able to register if we see things only as recipients coming from. It is those who are trained very well in that non-print literate culture that who are now shaping the print world. There is no doubt about it. But in that process, quite a range of new things happen. And unless we register them as constituting a modern, we probably will be missing an important crucial development that happened. Yeah, that is right. Right. Yeah. Okay. I think Deepika is not standing up. So
Any more questions?
Hi, I just have one question.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. Congratulations on the book and thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Shamla, and if I've heard it correctly, I think you asserted that the early 19th century Malayalam novel was a sign of modernity and not a representation of the time. If I heard it right, yeah. So it's just for clarification. I just wanted to know. So does the early Malayalam novel, as a sign of modernity, reflect the tension between historical representation, and does it reflect any kind of emergence of any modern consciousness? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean the question of representation. What I was trying to say is that it is not. We don't need to see novel as or largely literary writing as representational of things that are happening outside. So what I was trying to do is to write the literary history of the literary in its own terms. Literary itself, can we see the literary itself as a social and historical event, and then draw something about the kind of draw something to think about modernity as it happened at that point. That is so it's clearly it's a sign. Yes. So the question of representation in the sense is crucial in literary approaches. Often we see it as requiring literary writing as requiring some kind of interpretation in order to see what it actually represents. That what actually it is always outside or beyond the text, which we need to really through interpretive methods we need to retrieve. So critics' job is often that. I try to move away from that. Also because Uday Kumar has a very strong sentiment against such readings, and it took me some time to understand what exactly was the problem there, and I also fully agree with that. There is a problem. There's a problem in seeing literature as a sign of something else. Yeah.
I think it's time for winding up. So I hope there is no more questions. As we come to the end of this enriching discussion, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to each of you for being part of this conversation, and a special thanks to the discussants and the author Ashokan Nambiar. So now we are going to have a formal vote of thanks. I invite Professor Dr. Mohammed Kuria to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay, it's just a formality, but also more than formality. Thanks so much on behalf of iShore to the author, Dr. Ashokan Nambiar, for discussing the book in detail, for writing the book, major contribution to, many different fields, but definitely also to the study of Kerala. And as Dr. Pindo mentioned, I hope the book is read across disciplines, not only the immediate audience that the books like this receive. And also, I would like to thank Professor Uday Kumar and Rochelle Pinder for giving detailed comments and discussion on the book, and also engaging in detail with different questions and elaborating on different nuances for especially those who have not yet read the book, but would like to read the book, and giving an introduction to the wider context from which the book emerges and the broader implications the book would have in to different fields and different areas. And also to Dr. Rega Raj, she is one of us, part of the iShore team. But I would like to thank her also for moderating this session from the beginning till the very end. And also, not the least, I would like to thank all the members who, all the audience members who have participated and who have raised very interesting questions and comments. And yeah, stay tuned to our next talking text series sessions. We hope to discuss, we have been organizing it in almost one book every month, and hope to continue this with 2 more books before the summer break. So once again, thank you very much. Thanks everyone very much, and look forward to seeing you all soon in the next editions. Until then, good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.